The street lights cast long shadows across the empty downtown streets of Minneapolis as the clock struck 9:30 p.m. It had been another long day at the office for the state attorney general, who was finally heading home after reviewing case files that couldn't wait until morning. His dark blue BMW moved smoothly through the quiet streets, nothing unusual about it except perhaps how well maintained it was for a car that had seen its fair share of Minnesota winters. The radio played softly in the background, a local jazz station he often tuned to after stressful days. He was thinking about the upcoming community meeting he had to prepare for, mentally organizing his talking points about police reform and community relations. The irony of what was about to happen hadn't yet revealed itself. Through his rearview mirror, he first noticed a patrol car about 3 blocks back. He didn't think much of it. He'd been driving exactly at the speed limit, his registration was current, and all his lights were working. But something felt off when the patrol car started following him more closely. He'd been here before, that familiar unease settling in his stomach. Even in his position, even in his suit and tie, even in his state-issued vehicle, some things hadn't changed. The flash of red and blue lights illuminated his car's interior. He took a deep breath, reminding himself of the countless times he'd advised others how to handle situations like this. His hands moved to the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel, visible and still. The music that had been soothing his nerves just moments ago now felt distant and irrelevant. Officer James Mitchell had been with the force for 3 years. Young, ambitious, and unfortunately carrying the same unconscious biases that had plagued law enforcement for generations. He'd run the BMW's plates before even turning on his lights, a practice that, while common, often targeted certain drivers more than others. The registration came back clean, but something still made him suspicious. Maybe it was the late hour, maybe it was the expensive car, or maybe it was something else entirely, something he wouldn't want to admit to himself. As the officer approached, his flashlight beam swept across the car's interior, far more aggressively than necessary for a routine traffic stop. The Attorney General could see 2 more patrol cars pulling up behind the first one. Back up for what should have been a simple stop. The show of force was unnecessary, but unfortunately not surprising. License and registration, the officer demanded, his tone carrying an edge that suggested he'd already made assumptions about the driver. The Attorney General kept his voice steady, years of courtroom experience helping him maintain his composure. "Officer, may I ask why I'm being stopped?" The question seemed to irritate Officer Mitchell, whose hand instinctively moved closer to his belt. "I'll ask the questions here, sir. License and registration now." The way he emphasized "sir" carried a weight that anyone who'd experienced profiling would recognize immediately. Through the side mirror, the Attorney General could see the other officers standing by their vehicles, hands near their weapons, watching intently. What should have been a simple traffic stop had escalated into something else entirely. A scene that played out far too often on America's streets, but this time with an unexpected twist that would soon change everything. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Both men knew this moment was bigger than just a traffic stop, though Officer Mitchell didn't yet realize just how significant it would become. As the Attorney General reached slowly for his wallet, he was about to turn this moment of potential conflict into something much more powerful, a catalyst for real change. The flashlight beam danced across the car's interior, casting harsh shadows that made everything feel more dramatic than it needed to be. The Attorney General could feel his heart beating steadily, not from fear, but from a deep, familiar frustration. He'd been here too many times before, though usually sitting beside clients as their legal counsel, not as the one being questioned. "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Mitchell commanded, his voice carrying that edge of authority that seemed to demand immediate compliance. The backup officers shifted their positions, spreading out as if preparing for something that clearly wasn't necessary. Their hands remained close to their weapons, a detail that didn't go unnoticed by the Attorney General. As he carefully opened his door, The Attorney General's mind raced through years of similar scenarios he handled as a civil rights attorney. The same script seemed to play out time and time again. Unnecessary escalation, assumed guilt, the weight of prejudice masked behind procedure. But this time, something would be different. "Sir, you're driving an expensive vehicle in a high-crime area," Officer Mitchell stated, as if owning a nice car in your own city was somehow suspicious. The Attorney General stood tall, his suit jacket neat despite the long day at the office. His tie, though slightly loosened, still spoke of his professional status. None of that seemed to matter to the officer, whose tone grew increasingly aggressive with each passing moment. "I've lived in this city for over 20 years," the Attorney General replied calmly, his voice steady and clear. "I'm coming from my office downtown." He gestured toward the government buildings visible in the distance, their windows still lit despite the late hour. The officer's expression hardened, clearly not appreciating what he perceived as talking back. Another patrol car pulled up, its lights still flashing, adding to the unnecessary spectacle. The Attorney General noticed people starting to gather on the sidewalk, phones out, recording what was happening. Some recognized him immediately, their whispers carrying across the quiet street. "That's the Attorney General," someone said, loud enough for others to hear. Officer Mitchell's demeanor shifted slightly at the murmurs from the crowd, but he pressed on. "We've had reports of stolen vehicles matching this description," he claimed, though no such reports had actually been filed. It was a common excuse, one the Attorney General had heard countless times in similar cases he'd handled. "Officer," the Attorney General began, his voice carrying the weight of years of courtroom experience, "I'm going to reach for my identification now." He moved with deliberate slowness, years of experience having taught him the importance of clear, careful movements in situations like this. The gathering crowd had grown larger, their presence adding another layer of tension to the scene. The backup officers exchanged glances, something in their expressions suggesting they were beginning to realize this stop might have been a mistake. But Officer Mitchell seemed determined to maintain control of the situation, even as it was clearly slipping away from him. "I'd want you to understand something," the Attorney General continued, his voice calm, but carrying an authority that came from years of public service. "Before I show you my ID, I think it's important for you to know exactly who you've pulled over tonight." He paused, letting the moment hang in the air. The crowd had fallen silent, phones still recording, everyone sensing that something significant was about to happen. The streetlights cast long shadows across the scene, the red and blue flashing lights creating an almost theatrical atmosphere. In this moment, everyone present could feel that this wasn't just another traffic stop. This was about to become something much more. A teaching moment, a catalyst for change, and a powerful reminder that appearances and assumptions can be dangerously misleading. Time seemed to slow down as the Attorney General reached for his wallet. The crowd held their breath, phones still recording, capturing what was about to become a powerful moment in the ongoing conversation about law enforcement and civil rights. The flashing lights from the patrol cars painted everything in alternating red and blue, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. "I want you to watch carefully as I reach into my jacket," he said, his voice clear and measured. Officer Mitchell nodded stiffly, his hand still hovering near his belt. The backup officers remained in position, but their stance had changed subtly. Something in the Attorney General's calm demeanor had caught their attention. As he slowly withdrew his wallet, the Attorney General paused, looking directly at Officer Mitchell. "Before I open this," he said, "I think we need to have a conversation about why you really pulled me over tonight." His words carried weight, born from years of handling similar cases from the other side of the law. The growing crowd of onlookers had fallen completely silent. Someone whispered, "That's him. That's definitely him." And the whisper spread through the gathering like a wave. A few more people had joined, drawn by the unusual number of police cars and the growing crowd. Officer Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing that this routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine. "Sir, I've already explained. He began, but the Attorney General gently cut him off. Let me tell you who I am, he said, opening his wallet with deliberate slowness. I'm the Attorney General of Minnesota. He held up his official identification card, its gold state seal clearly visible in the harsh light of the police spotlights. And I believe we're about to have a very important discussion of police practices in this state. The change in the atmosphere was instant and palpable. Officer Mitchell's face went through a series of rapid transformations: disbelief, shock, and finally, the dawning realization of the magnitude of his mistake. The backup officers straightened up, their hands dropping away from their weapons. One of them whispered something into his radio, and within moments, a senior officer's voice crackled back through. The crowd erupted in a mix of reactions. Some gasped, others nodded knowingly, and a few even clapped. The Attorney General raised his hand, calming the crowd. This wasn't about public spectacle. It was about something much more important. Now, the Attorney General continued, his voice carrying the authority of his office, but maintaining its calm, measured tone. We have two choices here. We can treat this as an embarrassing incident that everyone tries to forget, or we can use it as a teaching moment. A chance to make real changes in how our police department interacts with our community. Officer Mitchell's face had lost its aggressive edge, replaced by something that looked like a mix of embarrassment and concern. The other officers had moved closer, presumably waiting for guidance on how to handle this unexpected situation. One of them, wearing sergeant's stripes, was already on his phone, likely calling higher up the chain of command. The Attorney General glanced at the gathering crowd, their phones still recording every moment. He knew this incident would be all over social media within hours, but that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it took a moment like this, when someone with authority experiences what ordinary citizens go through regularly, to create real change. I propose we take this conversation somewhere more constructive, he suggested, gesturing toward the government building where his office was located. Not as adversaries, but as people who both want to make our communities safer and more just for everyone. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. It had become an opportunity, a chance to transform an instance of profiling into a catalyst for positive change. The Attorney General could already see tomorrow's headlines, but more importantly, he could see a path forward. The police station buzzed with unusual energy at midnight. News of the traffic stop had spread through the department like wildfire, and officers from every shift huddled around computers, reviewing the body camera footage that would soon become national news. The night shift commander, a veteran of 25 years, watched the video for the third time, his face growing more concerned with each viewing. In the break room, officers spoke in hushed tones about what had happened. Did you hear? It was the Attorney General himself, one whispered, stirring his coffee absently. Others shared similar stories they'd witnessed or heard about, times when assumptions and quick judgments had led to uncomfortable situations. The incident had cracked open a door that usually stayed firmly shut, allowing conversations that needed to happen. Meanwhile, in the Attorney General's office, phones wouldn't stop ringing. Local news stations had somehow gotten wind of the story, probably from the bystanders' social media posts that were already going viral. His assistant, who had rushed back to the office despite the late hour, juggled calls from reporters while the Attorney General sat at his desk, thoughtfully reviewing his notes from the impromptu meeting that had just ended. The meeting had been remarkable in its own way. Instead of filing complaints or demanding immediate disciplinary action, the Attorney General had invited Officer Mitchell and his supervisor to sit down and talk. The conversation had been uncomfortable at first, with tension thick in the air, but as minutes turned into hours, something unexpected happened. I want you to understand why this matters, the Attorney General had said, sharing stories from his years as a civil rights attorney. He talked about families who'd lost trust in law enforcement, about promising young people who'd had their confidence shattered by similar stops, about the weight of always feeling like a suspect in your own neighborhood. Officer Mitchell, his initial defensiveness gradually melting away, had started opening up too. He talked about the pressures of the job, the split-second decisions, and the biases he hadn't even realized he carried. "I'd never thought of myself as prejudiced," he admitted, his voice heavy with realization. "But tonight made me question everything about how I approach my job." Outside, camera crews had started gathering, their news vans lining up along the street. The story was too powerful to ignore. A state attorney general experiencing the same type of profiling he'd fought against throughout his career. But inside his office, away from the media circus, real change was beginning to take shape. The attorney general's phone buzzed with a text from his teenage son. "Dad, you're trending on social media. You okay?" He smiled slightly, typing back a reassuring response. This wasn't how he planned to start a conversation about police reform, but sometimes the most powerful moments came from unexpected places. Down in the records department, clerks were already pulling Officer Mitchell's previous traffic stop records. The data would tell its own story, but numbers alone wouldn't capture the human element of what had happened tonight. The Attorney General knew that real change would require more than statistics and policy updates. It would need understanding, empathy, and a willingness to have difficult conversations. As midnight turned to early morning, the story continued to spread. News channels prepared their morning headlines, social media buzzed with shared videos and commentary, and in homes across the city, families began discussing what had happened. But unlike many similar incidents that had made headlines before, this one carried a different energy, a sense of possibility, a chance for real change. The Attorney General looked out his office window at the news vans below. Tomorrow would bring a storm of interviews, statements, and public reaction. But tonight had shown him something important, that even in moments of confrontation, there was room for understanding. Sometimes it took a dramatic moment like this to open people's eyes to realities they'd been unwilling or unable to see before. By sunrise, the story had exploded across every major news platform. The community center downtown was packed with people, all sharing their own experiences and reactions to what had happened. An elderly gentleman stood up, his voice shaking with emotion as he spoke about his grandson experiencing similar stops. "But this time," he said, "someone with power can actually show the world what we've been talking about all these years." The morning news shows played clips from the bystander videos on repeat. Each replay showed the same scene from different angles: the Attorney General's calm demeanor, the officer's realization, the gathering crowd. Social media was flooded with similar stories from people across the city, each one adding their voice to a conversation that had been simmering for years. At the local coffee shop near the police station, conversations buzzed over steaming cups. "Did you see what happened last night?" asked a regular customer to the barista. "My brother's been pulled over 3 times this month for no reason." Maybe now someone will finally listen. The barista nodded, sharing how her own father had changed his route to work to avoid certain areas where he'd been repeatedly stopped. The police union held an emergency meeting, trying to craft their response. The room was divided. Some defended the officer's actions as standard procedure, while others saw this as a wake-up call. A veteran officer stood up, his voice cutting through the heated debate. "Look," he said, "we can either fight this and lose public trust completely, or we can use this moment to make real changes in how we do our jobs." Meanwhile, at a local high school, students gathered during lunch break to watch the news coverage on their phones. A teacher overheard them discussing the incident and turned it into an impromptu civics lesson. The students shared stories about their own families' experiences, many speaking up for the first time about encounters they'd previously been too nervous to discuss. The Attorney General's phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. National news networks wanted interviews, community leaders sought statements, and police departments from other cities called asking for guidance. But what caught his attention most was an email from Officer Mitchell, sent at 4 a.m. after what had clearly been a sleepless night. "I've been thinking about last night nonstop," the officer had written. "I always prided myself on being fair, but watching that body camera footage, I saw myself through different eyes. I'd like to be part of making things better, if you'll let me. At the community center, a local organizer who'd been working on police reform for years wiped tears from her eyes as she addressed the crowd. "We've been trying to tell this story for so long," she said. "Sometimes it takes someone with a title for people to finally listen, but what matters is that they're listening now." The city council called an emergency session to discuss police training and oversight. The council chambers were packed, with people spilling into the hallways. Everyone wanted to speak, to share their experiences, to be part of the solution. The Attorney General sat quietly in the back, listening to story after story, each one reinforcing why this moment mattered so much. Outside the police station, a small group of officers talked during their lunch break. "You know," one said, looking at his colleagues, "maybe we need to think differently about how we approach traffic stops." The others nodded, sharing their own thoughts about changes they could make in their daily patrols. As evening approached, the Attorney General stood at his office window, watching protesters gather peacefully in the square below. Their signs didn't call for punishment or retribution. Instead, they asked for understanding, for change, for a chance to build something better. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. It had become a moment of possibility, a chance to transform years of frustration and mistrust into real, lasting change. The Internal Affairs Office hummed with activity as investigators pored over years of traffic stop data. Computer screens displayed countless spreadsheets, each telling part of a larger story. One investigator removed her glasses, rubbing her tired eyes as she noticed a pattern emerging from the numbers. "You need to see this," she called to her supervisor, pointing at her screen. The data painted a clear picture. Certain officers consistently pulled over minority drivers at rates far higher than their colleagues. Officer Mitchell's record wasn't unique. It was part of a larger pattern that had gone unnoticed or unacknowledged for too long. The supervisor leaned back in his chair, the weight of the evidence sinking in. Down the hall, a team reviewed body camera footage from hundreds of stops. They watched hour after hour of interactions, taking careful notes about tone, behavior, and language used. The differences in how various drivers were treated became impossible to ignore. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, one reviewer said, shaking his head, "but I've never looked at it quite like this before." The Attorney General had assembled a special task force, bringing together police officers, community leaders, and civil rights experts. They sat around a large conference table, sharing perspectives that rarely found common ground. A young officer spoke up, his voice quiet but determined. "I became a cop to help people," he said. "If we're making parts of our community feel unsafe, we're failing at our jobs." In the records room, clerks pulled files that revealed complaint patterns. Many had been dismissed without proper investigation, filed away, and forgotten. A longtime clerk remembered each one. She'd seen the frustration on people's faces as they filled out forms, knowing nothing would likely come of it. Now, finally, someone was looking. The police chief called a department-wide meeting. Officers filled the briefing room, some standing along the walls. The room fell silent as dash cam video from the Attorney General's stop played on the screen. "This isn't about pointing fingers," the chief said afterward. "This is about being honest with ourselves about how we do our jobs." Community members began coming forward, sharing their experiences with a new review board. An older gentleman brought in a notebook where he documented every stop he experienced over the past 5 years. Dates, times, officer badge numbers. "I kept thinking someone would eventually want to know," he said, sliding the worn notebook across the table. Officer Mitchell sat through hours of interviews, answering difficult questions about his patrol patterns and decision-making process. Instead of becoming defensive, he leaned into the discomfort. "I never thought I was doing anything wrong," he admitted. "But when you look at the numbers, when you hear the stories, it makes you question everything." The investigation expanded beyond traffic stops. Department policies, training materials, and supervision practices all came under scrutiny. A senior trainer discovered outdated materials that potentially reinforced biases. "We've been teaching things a certain way for so long," she said. "We never stopped to ask if there was a better way." Late one evening, the Attorney General sat in his office, reviewing preliminary findings. Each page told part of a story he'd known existed, but had never seen documented so thoroughly. His assistant brought in another stack of emails from departments across the country, all asking about their investigation process. This wasn't just about one department anymore. It was becoming a template for change. In the police academy, new recruits watched video of the traffic stop, followed by discussions about bias and community relations. Their questions showed a different mindset than previous classes, less about power and control, more about service and understanding. The incident had already begun changing how the next generation of officers viewed their role. The investigation wasn't just about finding fault. It was about understanding how biases shaped everyday decisions, how procedures could reinforce prejudices, and most importantly, how to create meaningful change. As one investigator put it, "We're not just looking at what went wrong. We're figuring out how to make it right." 6 months after the traffic stop, the police department's training room looked very different. Instead of just officers, the room was filled with a mix of community members, civil rights advocates, and law enforcement personnel. They sat together in small groups, sharing experiences and perspectives that would have gone unspoken just months ago. The Attorney General stood at the front of the room, watching as Officer Mitchell led a discussion about traffic stop procedures. The same officer who had pulled him over was now helping to reshape department policy. "We have to understand," Officer Mitchell explained to his colleagues, "that every interaction leaves a lasting impression on someone's life." In the dispatch center, new protocols flashed across computer screens. Every traffic stop now required clear documentation of the reason for the stop, with regular reviews of patterns and practices. A dispatcher watched as an officer called in a stop, following the new procedures perfectly. "It's different now," she told the trainee. "We're not just logging incidents, we're making sure everything happens the right way." The changes weren't just on paper. Body cameras had become mandatory, but more importantly, officers now regularly reviewed their own footage with supervisors and community members. In one review session, a young officer watched his traffic stops from the previous month. "I never noticed how my tone changed depending on who I was talking to," he admitted, the realization visible on his face. Community feedback sessions, once sparsely attended formalities, now drew crowds that filled local community centers. People felt heard for the first time, and police officers began to see their work through different eyes. An older officer shared his perspective with new recruits. "I've been doing this job for 20 years, but I'm learning something new at every session." The Attorney General's office had become a hub for reform. Police departments from across the state sent representatives to learn about the new programs. They carried back not just policy documents, but a new understanding of what community policing could look like. "It's not about making our jobs harder," one visiting sergeant observed. "It's about making them matter more." In the police academy, training now included regular meetings with community members who shared their experiences with law enforcement. These weren't just lectures. They were conversations that often continued long after the formal sessions ended. New recruits learned about the impact of their future actions from the people they would serve. Officer Mitchell's transformation became a powerful example of change. He worked with a team of officers and community members to develop new training materials. "We can't change the past," he often said, "but we can make sure the future looks different." His honesty about his own biases and willingness to learn helped others face their own prejudices. The department's computer systems now generated monthly reports showing stop patterns, helping supervisors identify potential issues before they became problems. But beyond the statistics, officers began sharing stories of positive community interactions. These stories were celebrated as much as arrest records had been in the past. Local businesses noticed the change too. A coffee shop owner spoke about how officers now regularly stopped by to chat with customers, not just to grab coffee and go. They're part of the community now, she said, not just watching it from their patrol cars. The Attorney General made sure the changes went beyond his city. He worked with state legislators to pass new laws requiring similar reforms statewide. In committee meetings, he shared his own experience, but also the stories of countless others who had faced similar situations without his position or power to create change. As evening fell on another training session, an officer and a community member walked out together, still deep in conversation. This simple scene, two people from different worlds finding common ground, represented everything the reforms aimed to achieve. Real change wasn't just about new policies or procedures. It was about building bridges between people who had viewed each other with suspicion for too long. 1 year after that fateful traffic stop, the Attorney General stood at a podium in front of the police academy. Behind him, a new class of recruits sat alongside veteran officers and community members. The room buzzed with an energy that felt different from the tension of a year ago. This was the energy of hope and progress. A year ago, he began, a routine traffic stop changed not just my life, but our entire community. He glanced at Officer Mitchell, who now sat on the department's Community Relations Board. The officer nodded slightly, both of them knowing how far things had come. The numbers told part of the story. Traffic stop data showed a 60% decrease in racial disparities, but the real changes went deeper than statistics. In local coffee shops, officers and residents chatted easily. At community events, children no longer tensed up when police cars drove by. Trust was being rebuilt, one interaction at a time. A local newspaper reporter sat in the back of the room, taking notes for a follow-up story. She'd covered the original incident and had documented the changes throughout the year. The most remarkable thing, she'd written in her notebook, isn't just what changed, but how it changed. The transformation hadn't come through force or fear, but through understanding and commitment to do better. The police chief shared new data with his command staff. Complaint numbers had dropped significantly, while positive community feedback had increased. But more importantly, officers reported feeling more satisfied with their work. "We're not just enforcing laws anymore," one sergeant said during a briefing. "We're building relationships." In the training room, new recruits watched body camera footage from different traffic stops, before and after the changes. The differences were striking. Officers now approached vehicles with respect rather than suspicion. They explained the reasons for stops clearly. They listened when community members spoke. The Attorney General's phone still rang with calls from other states wanting to learn from their experience. A folder on his desk held letters from people sharing their own stories, many thanking him for turning his experience into something positive. "Your story gave me hope," one letter read. It showed that change is possible. Officer Mitchell had become a regular speaker at police training sessions across the country. He shared his story openly, helping other officers recognize and address their own biases. "It's not about shame," he would tell them. "It's about growth." His honesty helped others face uncomfortable truths about themselves and their work. At a community center, an elderly resident shared stories with young police cadets about how things used to be and how they were different now. "I used to tell my grandchildren to be afraid," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Now I tell them to be confident. That's what real change looks like." The reforms had spread beyond traffic stops. The entire department had shifted towards a more community-centered approach. Officers knew residents by name, attended neighborhood meetings, and worked to solve problems before they became crimes. It wasn't just about enforcement anymore. It was about being part of the community they served. As the Attorney General concluded his speech, he looked out at the faces before him. Officers, community members, activists, all now working together. "What happened that night could have divided us further," he said. "Instead, it brought us together. It showed us that change isn't just possible, it's essential." The legacy of that traffic stop lived on in every positive interaction between police and community members, in every fair and respectful traffic stop, in every moment when someone chose understanding over suspicion. It wasn't just a story about what went wrong. It had become a story about how to make things right.